He knelt beside him in prayer. Then, he had him dragged away in chains before the incense even cleared. This is the story of the final mass a Tsar shared with the man he had already condemned. Welcome to the Judas Archives. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Tonight, we open another file from the archive. We are taught that betrayal comes from a single hand, a single decision, a single moment we can point to and name. But sometimes the deepest betrayals unfold slowly, disguised as devotion, right up until the final prayer is spoken. Tonight, we step into 16th century Russia to dissect the anatomy of one of the most devastating and most disputed chapters in the country's history, the destruction of Novgorod, one of Russia's oldest and wealthiest cities, at the hands of its own Tsar. Novgorod had spent centuries as a semi-independent trading power, proud of a political tradition older, and in some ways freer, than Moscow's own. At its spiritual center stood Archbishop Pimen, a man respected across the city, who would soon find that respect meant nothing at all to the Tsar marching toward his cathedral. Ivan, the first Tsar of all Russia, had spent years locked in a brutal war for territory along the Baltic. Plague and famine were spreading through his own capital, and somewhere in the exhausted, paranoid depths of his mind, suspicion had begun to fix itself on the wealthy, independent city of Novgorod. A citizen named Petr Volinets brought Ivan a warning that Novgorod's nobles were secretly plotting to defect, to hand the city over to Russia's enemies in Lithuania. Most modern historians believe this conspiracy never actually existed, but belief, to a paranoid Tsar already convinced of betrayal everywhere, was never something that required proof. Ivan had built a personal army answerable to no one but himself, the Oprichniki, men bound by loyalty to the Tsar alone, rather than to Russia's traditional nobility. He ordered them to march on Novgorod, not to negotiate, but to punish a betrayal that existed, as far as anyone can determine today, almost entirely in his own mind. The march itself became a preview of what was coming. Towns and villages along the route were looted and burned. Word reached Novgorod days before the Tsar himself did, though no one in the city fully understood what was actually approaching them. Archbishop Pimen, hearing that the Tsar himself was approaching, had no reason to believe he was in any danger. He had committed no treason. He prepared instead to welcome his Tsar the way tradition demanded, with the full ceremony and reverence of the Church. In early January 1570, Ivan arrived at the gates of Novgorod. The city, still believing this was simply a tense but survivable royal visit, had no idea that the Tsar had already decided its fate long before he crossed its threshold. Ivan rode through the streets in silence, offering no explanation, no accusation, no warning. The people of Novgorod watched their own Tsar pass through their city like a stranger they had every reason to fear and no way to understand. Pimen greeted him at the cathedral steps with full ceremonial honor, exactly as tradition required. Ivan accepted the greeting, and then, without a single word of accusation, he asked the archbishop to do one final thing before anything else happened: celebrate the divine liturgy together, one last time. Inside St. Sophia Cathedral, Tsar and Archbishop stood side by side, as they had at countless ceremonies before. To every worshipper in that cathedral, It looked like an ordinary act of devotion. It was, in fact, the last thing Pimen would ever do as a free man. For the length of that Mass, Ivan knelt, prayed, and received communion beside the man he had already condemned in his own mind. Whatever Ivan believed about Novgorod's guilt, it did not stop him from sharing this sacred moment with its archbishop as though nothing at all was wrong. Near the cathedral doors, Ivan's men waited in silence, already positioned, already prepared. The Mass was never a gesture of respect. It was the final piece of theater before the arrest. The moment the final blessing was given, the moment the incense had barely begun to clear, Ivan's entire demeanor changed. The Tsar, who had knelt in prayer only seconds earlier, now turned to face the archbishop with something entirely different in his eyes. Ivan accused Pimen, publicly, inside the very cathedral where they had just prayed together, of conspiring with Novgorod's nobles to defect to Lithuania. Pimen, a man who had spent his entire life in service to the church, had no way to defend himself against an accusation built on a conspiracy that likely never existed at all. He was seized immediately, still in his ceremonial vestments, and dragged from the cathedral he had led for years. The final Mass, it turned out, had never been an act of devotion at all. It had been the last trap of a man who had already decided everything before he ever knelt to pray. Under torture, Pimen eventually confessed to crimes historians overwhelmingly believe he never committed. A confession extracted through violence proves nothing about guilt, only about how much pain a person can be made to endure before the words being demanded of them finally come. What began as an accusation against a single archbishop expanded within hours into something far larger. Novgorod's wealthiest and most prominent families, boyars, merchants, clergy, were rounded up across the city. The Tsar's private war against a conspiracy that likely never existed was about to become a war against the entire city itself. Historical accounts, though their exact reliability remains debated, describe prisoners being driven onto the frozen Volkhov River, where holes had been cut into the ice. What followed, over the course of more than a month, became one of the most devastating episodes of state violence in Russian history. Estimates of how many people died in the weeks that followed vary enormously. Modern historians, working from the city's likely population at the time, suggest a toll in the thousands. Older and more traditional accounts claim numbers many times higher. The exact scale of what happened here may never be fully known. For over a month, Novgorod burned. Homes were looted. Farmland surrounding the city was destroyed, and the systematic terror continued daily. The city that had stood as one of Russia's proudest and wealthiest centers for centuries was being dismantled, piece by piece, by its own sovereign. Those who survived were left with a city stripped of its wealth, its leadership, and its independence. Many were forcibly deported elsewhere in Russia, scattering what remained of Novgorod's population and severing its centuries of accumulated influence entirely. Ivan left Novgorod the way he had entered it, composed, unreadable, offering no acknowledgement of what he had just done. Whatever conviction had driven him to destroy the city, he carried it away with him entirely intact. Pimen was not simply exiled. He was stripped of his rank and his vestments, forced onto a mare, and paraded through the ruins of his own city while mocking minstrels followed behind him. It was a deliberate, calculated humiliation, aimed at the very dignity he had spent a lifetime building. Accounts of his final years diverge. Some say he died in prison within a year. Others place his death several years later in Moscow. What remains certain is that the man who had shared a sacred Mass with his own Tsar, only to be dragged away the moment it ended, never received anything resembling justice for what was done to him. Novgorod never fully recovered its former status. The city that had once rivaled Moscow in wealth and independence became, within a single generation, a diminished, subordinate outpost. The scale of the destruction, however it is ultimately measured, permanently altered the course of Russian history. The Oprichnina, the very institution Ivan had built to enforce his paranoid vision of loyalty, did not survive much longer. When Russia faced a genuine military crisis only a year later, the same men who had terrorized Novgorod civilians proved unable to defend the country against real enemies at all. No surviving account from Novgorod itself, written at the actual time of the massacre, has ever been found. The detailed stories we know today were recorded decades, sometimes centuries, later. Some historians argue this makes the traditional narrative unreliable. Most still believe something genuinely catastrophic happened here, even if its exact shape has been blurred by time. Historians continue to debate this event today, not because anyone doubts that Ivan destroyed something precious in Novgorod, but because the exact scale, and even some of its most dramatic details, remain genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story, it is the story. If you are sitting in the quiet tonight, having shared one final moment of trust with someone who had already decided to destroy you, remember this. The mind can always find a reason to justify what it has already decided to do. The heart never forgets a shared prayer used as the final act before betrayal. The mind can always find a reason to destroy what it fears, even a city that knelt in worship beside it. Their city fell, but the question of exactly how much, and exactly why, somehow, never has. Thank you for spending another night in the archives. If this story brought you comfort, leave a broken heart emoji below, and subscribe to join our quiet community. Until we meet again in the dark, see you next time. You are not alone. Goodbye.